There are over 1,000 Space Marine chapters scattered across the galaxy, 1,000 brotherhoods of genetically altered warriors, 1,000 homeworlds, 1,000 fortress monasteries carved from rock and iron and faith, 1,000 chapter banners that have flown above battles whose names most people will never hear. Each chapter has its own heraldry, its own rituals, its own way of naming the dead and honoring the living, and teaching young men who are about to become something far larger than what they were born as, something larger and fiercer and more terrible. Each chapter has its own answer to the question of what it means to serve the Emperor, and the answers are as varied as the men who give them. Most people, when they think of Space Marines, picture cobalt blue, gold trim, the proud, squared-off architecture of Ultramarines plate, the bold U on the shoulder, the sense of a chapter so certain of its own importance that even its color scheme reads like an announcement. Or they picture the red and black of the Blood Angels, romantic and tragic in equal measure, the most aesthetically beautiful chapter in a setting that occasionally forgets aesthetics are allowed. Or the Space Wolves in their ash gray and their furs, the howling, Viking-inflected war brotherhood of Fenris, or the Black Templars, or the Dark Angels, or the Imperial Fists, the famous ones, the ones that appear on every cover and in every starter box, and whose names you already knew before you pressed play on this video. But there is a chapter that most people, even people who have been playing this game and reading this lore for years, have never heard of. And that, genuinely, is a tragedy, because their story is one of the most compelling, most emotionally devastating, most righteously furious pieces of lore in the entire 41st millennium. It is a story about honor, and about what happens when you have the audacity to speak truth to power in a universe that was specifically designed to punish truth-tellers. It is a story about brothers who found themselves fighting a war on two fronts simultaneously. One war against alien enemies they could see and name and shoot, and another war against the Imperial machinery itself, a machinery so vast and so self-protective that it barely needed to acknowledge them while it ground them down. It is a story about a chapter that was functionally destroyed for the crime of filing a complaint, and then kept going anyway. This is the story of the Celestial Lions, a chapter of Space Marines with roots in the warrior tribes of a feral jungle world, with a culture built around community and storytelling, and the absolute refusal to let the dead be forgotten, and with a history that reads less like a heroic saga, and more like a case study in how institutions consume the people who dare to criticize them. Before we begin, if you are watching this right now, wherever you are, whatever time it is, I want to know. Drop it in the comments. Where in the world are you? What time is it there? There is something genuinely wonderful about the fact that we are all here, in this community, at different corners of the planet, listening to stories about people who lived and died 10,000 years in a fictional future. I read every comment. And while you are there, subscribe, because what we do on this channel takes real time and real research, and the community that is gathered here is the reason it is worth doing. Now, the Celestial Lions, Part 1. Sons of Dorn Origins, Gene Seed, and the Weight of Inheritance. To understand the Celestial Lions, you first have to understand what it means to carry the blood of Rogel Dorn. Rogel Dorn was the Primarch of the Imperial Fists, and he was not like the other Primarchs. Where Angron was fury, and Magnus was intellect, and Sanguinius was grace, Dorn was something quieter and harder, and in many ways more frightening. He was endurance. He was the refusal to yield. He was the architect who looked at the endless, grinding darkness of the galaxy, and responded not by trying to overcome it, but by building something unbreakable to stand against it, and then standing behind that thing he had built, and then standing there some more when the thing started cracking, and standing there after it had cracked completely, fighting in the rubble of the fortress he had raised, because there was nowhere else to be. Dorn's chapters are marked by this inheritance. The Imperial Fists themselves are legendary for their siege warfare, for defending positions that should not be defensible, for holding lines after everyone else has retreated, for never, ever yielding the ground they have been given to hold. His successor chapters carry this forward in different ways. The Black Templars channel it as crusading zeal, an inexhaustible drive forward that never stops moving, never stops looking for the next enemy to destroy. The Crimson Fists channel it as survivor's stubbornness, a chapter that was nearly annihilated and continued anyway as a matter of sheer principle. The Fists Exemplar, the Soul Drinkers in their tragic arc, the Executioners, all of them expressing something of what Dorn was through the specific circumstances of their own histories. The Celestial Lions were created at some point during the latter years of the 38th millennium. The exact founding is recorded in Imperial archives as unnamed, which is itself a detail worth sitting with for a moment, because the Imperium tends toward obsessive record-keeping in some areas, while being remarkably, almost deliberately careless in others. Chapters created at the height of Imperial administrative attention, chapters created to serve prestigious roles near important systems, tend to have their founding dates and circumstances meticulously recorded. Chapters created for peripheral duties, for the watching of distant and unglamorous corners of the galaxy, sometimes slip through the cracks of the archival process. Their founding is listed as unknown, which can mean the records were lost, or it can mean the records were never created with the care that would have preserved them. Either way, the Celestial Lions came into being carrying the gene seed of the Imperial Fists, that genetic inheritance that makes them technically, biologically, sons of Dorn, brothers to every chapter that draws from the same source. They were created to serve in a distant region of the Ultima Segmentum, the vast galactic east of Imperial space, in an area called Ilara's Veil, and they were, in the most practical sense, created to be forgotten. Not from malice, not from deliberate erasure, but from the simple, grinding logic of Imperial priority. Ilara's Veil was not important enough to warrant the kind of sustained attention that would have made its guardians famous. What this meant in practice was a chapter that existed in genuine isolation, far from the great campaigns that dominate the history books, far from the sight of the administratum and the high lords, and the propaganda machinery that creates the famous chapters by writing about them and celebrating them and including them in the official histories. The Celestial Lions spent thousands of years doing the quiet, essential, thankless work of keeping a corner of the galaxy from falling apart. And they did it without an audience. And they became good at it in exactly the way that organizations become good at things when they have no choice but to either become good at them or fail. The self-sufficiency that isolation produces is real, and it runs deep. A chapter that knows reinforcements are months or years away, in the best case, learns to make decisions with the resources it has. A chapter that cannot rely on adjacent chapters for support learns to be genuinely good at every aspect of its own operation, because there is no one else to cover the gaps. A chapter that operates far from the scrutiny of the higher imperial institutions learns consciously, or not, to develop its own internal standards, rather than relying on external approval as its guide. These qualities shape the Lions before the specific culture of their homeworld even enters the picture. They were already, by the logic of their situation, going to be a self-contained, resilient, deeply internally focused brotherhood. What their homeworld gave them was the specific texture of that brotherhood, the warmth of it, the communal depth of it, the storytelling tradition that would prove to be both their most distinctive cultural feature and the thing that most sharply distinguished them from a chapter like the Imperial Fists themselves. Their armor deserves a moment here. Gold and black, in the traditional depictions, not the heavy, slightly oppressive gold of some wealthy merchant displaying status, but something that reads more like light, caught unexpectedly in a dark place. Black for the void they operated in, perhaps, or for the night jungles of their homeworld, where everything of importance happened in the dark and you learned to navigate by feel and sound rather than sight. And gold for visibility, for the ability to be seen across a battlefield, to be recognized as a friendly presence in the chaos of combat, to carry light into the darkness in the most literal possible sense. The chapter's internal terminology is worth dwelling on, because it tells you something about who they decided to be, in contrast to the template they were given. In the Codex Astartes, the organizing document of Space Marine chapter structure, written by Robert Gilliman in the aftermath of the Horus Heresy, the titles of chapter positions are standardized. Chapter Master, Captain, Chaplain, Librarian, Apothecary, Sergeant. These words carry 10,000 years of tradition, and they mean specific things in the military hierarchy of the Adeptus Astartes. The Celestial Lions use these positions, but name them differently. Their chaplains are death speakers. Their librarians are spirit walkers. Their senior company commanders are war leaders. The most senior among them carries the title of Pride Leader. These are not simply cosmetic differences, not mere rebranding for the sake of distinctiveness. They are a genuine cultural statement. They are titles that carry meaning in the specific context of Elysium 9, the chapter's homeworld, titles that would have been understood and respected by the tribal elders and the community councils of the jungle clans from which the chapter's warriors were drawn. They say, "We are the Imperial Fist's children, yes, and we carry that inheritance, but we are also Elysium's children, and that inheritance is equally present in us. Both are true. Neither is in service of the other." This kind of dual cultural identity is actually quite common among the successor chapters of various Primarchs. And the chapters that have managed it most successfully tend to be the ones that take their homeworld cultures most seriously as living sources of value, rather than simply as aesthetic inspiration. The Space Wolves are the obvious example. A chapter so deeply invested in the culture of Fenris that they barely resemble the Codex template at all, and which has produced some of the most distinctive and compelling warriors in the setting. The Celestial Lions found their own version of this with Elysium 9, and the result was a chapter that felt genuinely alive in a way that pure Codex adherence rarely achieves. Their combat doctrine reflected both inheritances, the stubbornness of Dorn, the commitment to holding, to not giving ground, to standing when others would retreat, married to the tactical flexibility and emphasis on flanking movements and guile that the jungle warfare environment of Elysium 9 would naturally cultivate. In the jungle, frontal assault is rarely the correct answer. In the jungle, patience and positioning and the precise timing of strikes matter more than raw power. The Lions took Dorn's iron will and paired it with the hunting wisdom of their homeworld's warrior tribes, and the result was a chapter with an unusual capacity for both the kind of grinding, attrition-based warfare that Sons of Dorn excel at, and the kind of precise, rapidly shifting engagement that jungle warfare demands. Part 2. Elysium.I. It's the world that shaped everything. Elysium I. The name itself is a kind of joke, or at least it seems like one, when you encounter it for the first time alongside a description of what the planet actually is. Elysium. Named for paradise in the classical mythologies of ancient humanity. Named for the place the honored dead were supposed to go after a life well lived. Named for something golden and peaceful and fundamentally far from what Elysium 9 actually was. Elysium 9 was a dense, dark, enormous jungle world sitting in the Alara's Vale region of the Ultima Segmentum, and it was beautiful in the specific way that dangerous places are beautiful completely and uncomplicatedly hostile to anything that was not fully adapted to it, which meant that everything that had adapted to it was doing so with a quality of concentrated, urgent aliveness that made the tame and domesticated places of the galaxy feel pale by comparison. The canopy of Elysium 9's jungles reached so high and was so dense that the lower levels of the ecosystem existed in permanent twilight, a rich green darkness punctuated by the specific quality of light that filters through layers of living material. Bioluminescent organisms provided their own illumination where the filtered daylight was insufficient. The sounds were constant, the calls of creatures, the drip of water, the subtle percussion of a living system continuously adjusting to itself. The creatures of Elysium the Ninth were not gentle. This is not a world where the megafauna grazes peacefully on plains while apex predators keep a respectful distance. This is a world where every layer of the food chain is engaged in a continuous, creative arms race of predation and counter-predation, where the creatures at the top of the hierarchy are not simply large and powerful, but specifically, precisely engineered by evolution to be effective in this particular environment in ways that creatures from other biomes cannot easily match. The great cats of Elysium 9 are the most obvious example animals that hunt in coordinated groups, that communicate through vocalizations and posture and shared territorial understanding, that demonstrate strategic patience in a way that blurs the line between instinct and planning. The human tribes of Elysium 9 had been on the planet for long enough that the relationship between them and their environment was genuinely mutual rather than simply adversarial. They had learned to move through the jungle the way the jungle expected things to move through it quietly, with awareness, with attention paid to the network of signals that the ecosystem continuously broadcasts to those who know how to read them. They had developed technologies and practices specifically adapted to their environment, tools made from local materials, architectural approaches that worked with the jungle rather than against it, agricultural and hunter-gatherer strategies calibrated to the specific rhythms of Elysium 9's ecology. But what is most important for understanding the celestial lions is not the physical environment of Elysium 9, but the social environment that the physical environment produced. Because survival in a dense, dangerous, resource-constrained jungle ecosystem is not a solitary project. It cannot be. A single person, even a skilled one, does not reliably survive in a place like Elysium 9. A family might, though with difficulty. A tribe, a genuine community of interdependent people who know each other deeply enough to trust each other with their lives, who have developed shared strategies and shared skills and shared understanding of their territory, a tribe has a chance. This is not unique to Elysium 9. It is a pattern that appears in every human environment with sufficient pressure. The harder the environment, the more strongly communal the social organization that develops in response to it. What is specific to Elysium 9 is the particular form that this communalism took and the depth to which it was embedded in the culture's values. The tribes of Elysium 9 valued three things above all others: community, not as an abstract principle, but as a lived, daily practice of mutual responsibility. The specific attention you pay to the people beside you, the constant awareness that their well-being and yours are not separate things. Legacy, the understanding that you are part of something larger than yourself, in time, as well as in space, that the people who came before you built the world you inhabit, and the people who come after you will inhabit the world you build, and that this places real obligations on you in the present. And courage, not the loud, performative courage of warriors trying to impress each other, but the quieter and harder courage of people who are afraid and act anyway, specifically because the people beside them need them to. These three values organized everything in the tribal cultures of Elysium 9. They organized the governance of tribes, the raising of children, the conduct of intertribal relationships, the carrying out of hunts and agricultural cycles, the treatment of the sick and the dying, and above all, the treatment of the dead. Because how a culture treats its dead tells you almost everything about what it values among the living. The tribes of Elysium the Ninth did not simply bury or burn their dead and move on. They kept the dead present, not in a supernatural sense, not through any particular religious claim about what happens after death, but through the deliberate, conscious practice of continuing to speak about them, of making sure that the people who had lived and contributed and struggled and died were remembered not as abstract names on a monument, but as specific, irreplaceable individuals whose particular qualities, whose humor, whose skills, whose habitual ways of looking at problems, whose specific acts of courage or kindness or stubbornness were kept alive in the communal memory of the people who survived them. This practice of active remembrance was carried out primarily through storytelling, and storytelling on Elysium 9 was not the passive entertainment that the word might suggest to someone from a more textually literate culture. It was a skilled art, the primary technology of cultural transmission in a society without widespread written record-keeping. A gifted storyteller was not simply an entertainer. They were the keeper of the community's collective memory, the person responsible for making sure that what had been learned through painful experience was not lost with the individuals who had acquired it, that the dead continued to contribute to the well-being of the living through the stories that preserved what they had known and done. When the Celestial Lions chapter was formed from the warrior tribes of Elysium the Ninth, this entire cultural structure was not left on the planet. It came with the warriors. It was as much a part of them as their fighting technique or their understanding of the jungle ecosystem. And in the new context of a Space Marine chapter, a context in which the possibility of death was constant and the pace of loss could be extraordinary, the storytelling tradition found even more work to do. The chapter's death speakers, their chaplain-equivalent officers, became the primary institutional expression of the storytelling tradition. Their function went beyond the standard chaplain role of maintaining spiritual health and delivering battle rites. A death speaker of the Celestial Lions was also, perhaps primarily, a remembrancer, the person who knew the stories, who kept the specific, individual memories of the fallen, who could speak at a gathering of brothers not simply about the honorable conduct of the deceased in the abstract, but about the precise person, the specific individual, the irreplaceable voice and perspective that had been lost. This gave the Lions' relationship with their dead a texture that distinguished them from most other chapters. In many chapters, the death of a battle brother is honored with ceremony, the gene seed recovered, the body committed to flame or void, the name read aloud in the rolls of honor, and then the chapter moves on, because the alternative is to be paralyzed by grief in a universe where grief never stops arriving. The Lions honored the dead in the same way, with the same necessities, but they also did something more. They kept talking about them. They incorporated the dead into the living life of the chapter in a way that maintained the community across the boundary that death creates. This is not a small achievement. This is, arguably, the most human thing about a chapter of genetically engineered transhuman warriors. And it would prove, over the course of the catastrophe that was coming, to be both the thing that hurt the most and the thing that kept the chapter alive. Part 3. Brotherhood, Culture, and the Informal Truth About the Lions. Outsiders visiting the Celestial Lions for the first time, whether as representatives of the Administratum or Inquisition, or simply as battle companions from other chapters, consistently reported the same observation. The Lions felt different from other chapters. Not in the way that, say, the Blood Angels feel different, with their brooding intensity and the weight of the flaw pressing down on them. More like the difference between an organization built around hierarchy and protocol and one built around trust and kinship. The rank structure of the Lions was real. It functioned. In combat, orders were given and followed with the discipline that 10,000 years of Space Marine military doctrine had refined to its sharpest possible edge. A Pride leader's tactical decision was not debated in the middle of a firefight. A war leader's order to advance was not a suggestion. The hierarchy did exactly what military hierarchy is supposed to do, when lives depend on rapid, unambiguous decision-making. But outside of combat, the atmosphere was different. Markedly, noticeably different. A battle brother of the Celestial Lions spoke to his war leader the way you speak to an older brother. You respect and love with deference, yes, but also with candor, with the specific kind of honesty that only survives in relationships where the parties trust each other enough to say the difficult thing. A war leader was allowed to be uncertain in front of his brothers, to voice doubt, to think aloud in the presence of people he commanded, without it undermining his authority in any meaningful way. Because authority in the Lions was not dependent on the performance of infallibility. It was based on demonstrated capability and proven concern for the well-being of the community. This informality was not limited to senior to subordinate relationships. The Lions as a whole talked to each other with a warmth and a directness that distinguished them from the more distant, formal relationships that characterize many Space Marine chapters. They told jokes. They teased each other about habits and preferences, and the specific ways in which individual brothers were strange or difficult or unexpectedly soft on some subject that their exterior would suggest they were indifferent to. They gathered and told stories not only about the honored dead, but about each other, about the ongoing, living story of the chapter in the present tense. This communal practice of storytelling about the living was perhaps the most interesting aspect of the Lions' culture, because it created a specific kind of accountability. When your brothers are going to tell stories about you, accurate stories, detailed stories, stories that will circulate through the chapter for years, you have a strong incentive to be the kind of person whose story is worth telling well. Not in a showy, performative sense, in a substantive sense. You want to be the brother who came through when it mattered, who was reliable in the darkness, who held the line when the line needed holding, and who spoke the difficult truth when the truth needed speaking. This last quality, the willingness to speak difficult truths, would prove to be both the Lions' finest characteristic and the proximate cause of their near destruction. A chapter that values truth-telling as a core cultural practice does not easily learn to be silent when something wrong has been done, even if silence would be safer. And in the Imperium of mankind, in the 41st millennium, silence is very often much, much safer. The chapter's relationship with their gene lineage cousins, the other sons of Dorn, was warm in specific ways. The Black Templars. Despite being one of the most dramatically different chapters from the Lions, in terms of surface culture, the Templars' crusading fanaticism and religious intensity reading very differently from the lion's communal warmth, recognized a family resemblance in the lion's stubbornness, in their refusal to give ground, in the specific quality of their commitment that came from Dorn's gene seed, rather than from any deliberate stylistic choice. This recognition would matter enormously when the crisis came. The Lions showed particular respect to the warriors of other forces they fought alongside not just other Space Marine chapters, but the ordinary human soldiers of the Astra Militarum, the naval crews who carried them between systems, the PDF troopers who held defensive lines, while the Space Marines dealt with the more spectacular threats. This is not universal among Space Marine chapters. Some chapters treat regular human soldiers as tools to be used and discarded, as qualitatively different from the transhuman warriors, who are the real force in any engagement. The Lions treated human soldiers as, at minimum, people worth knowing by name. At best, as genuine brothers-in-arms whose courage in the absence of superhuman physical modification deserved its own specific kind of respect. This quality was a direct expression of Elysium 9's cultural inheritance. In a tribal environment, you cannot afford to treat any member of the community as disposable. Every person represents skills, relationships, accumulated knowledge that cannot easily be replaced. The Lions extended this logic outward, past the chapter itself, past the Space Marine tier of the Imperial hierarchy, down to the ordinary people who made up the body of the Imperium they were fighting to protect. It made them, in the most specific and meaningful sense, likable. Not in a simple or uncomplicated way. They were still Space Marines, still products of the most extreme genetic and psychological modification program in human history, still warriors, capable of and trained for acts of extraordinary violence. But they were likable in the way that people are likable, when they are genuinely paying attention to the people around them, when they are interested in you as a specific individual rather than a category or a function. This quality made the catastrophe that was coming more specifically, more individually painful. Because you cannot have that kind of chapter and then watch the chapter be destroyed without the destruction feeling personal in a way that the loss of a more abstracted, more coldly hierarchical organization would not. Part 4. Sentinels of the Veil, the Adeptus Veilari. The region called Alara's Veil sits in the Ultima Segmentum, and if you have to be told what the Ultima Segmentum is, you are not alone. The Imperium is vast, 1,000,000 worlds across the entire galaxy, organized into administrative regions of staggering scale. The Ultima Segmentum is the largest of these, the enormous expanse of imperial space on the galactic east, the direction away from Terra in the most literal spatial sense. It is the direction in which the Imperium becomes most frontier, most attenuated, most difficult to support and supply and govern. Ilara's Veil is the kind of region that appears on strategic maps as a scattering of dots in a poorly surveyed corner. It is a nebula, a region of stellar dust and gas that makes navigation through it genuinely difficult, that creates the kind of warp conditions that experienced shipmasters respect and inexperienced ones do not survive. The worlds within the veil are scattered, not clustered conveniently near major lanes of commerce or strategic importance. They are, to put it plainly, hard to get to and hard to defend, and not obviously worth the effort of either activity to anyone who has not spent enough time there to understand what would be lost if they fell. The Celestial Lions were the Imperium's answer to the question of what to do with this region. Give it to one chapter, let them sort it out, check back in when something dramatic happens. For thousands of years, that is exactly what the Lions did. They sorted it out. They cleared alien incursions before those incursions could reach the level of existential threat. They suppressed heretical cells before those cells could flower into full rebellions. They maintained a visible, active imperial presence in a region that would otherwise have had none, which matters more than it might seem, because the presence of Space Marines in a region acts as a deterrent as much as a response. Threats that might have tested the resolve of a less capable defender simply chose to apply pressure elsewhere. But there is a limit to what a single chapter can do across a region of this size. The mathematics are unyielding. A chapter has 10 companies at nominal strength, 1,000 warriors, against a region containing numerous worlds and a constantly refreshing slate of threats. The warriors cannot be everywhere at once. If you keep 3 companies occupied with one crisis, while another crisis emerges, and then a third crisis follows before the first two are resolved, you run out of forces very quickly. The Lions recognized this and did the correct thing. They asked for help. A formal petition was lodged with the Senatorum Imperialis, the High Council that governs the Imperium, requesting that Alara's Veil be given additional Space Marine support. The petition was accepted, and in the founding that followed the 25th founding, sometimes called the Bastion founding, 2 new chapters were created and assigned to the Veil. The first was the Emperor's Spears, a chapter recruited from the barbarian tribes of a storm world called Nemeton, fierce and traditional warriors who operated with an independence and a self-reliance that the Lions recognized and respected. The Emperor's Spears were not a comfortable, codex-adherent chapter. They were rough-edged and proud and deeply rooted in their homeworld's feral culture in a way that immediately made them kindred spirits to the Lions, regardless of their differing gene lineages. They would prove, over the course of the catastrophe that was coming, to be the most steadfast allies the Lions could have asked for. The second was the Star Scorpions. Their story is a tragedy of a different kind, not the tragedy of persecution and survival, but the tragedy of genetic doom, of a chapter whose gene seed carried flaws that eventually expressed themselves in ways that the chapter could not survive. The Star Scorpions served the Adeptus Veilari faithfully for a time, and then they were lost. Their entire chapter, fleet and all, disappeared into the warp during an event that Imperial records cannot fully account for. They were gone. The Adeptus Veilari was reduced to 2 chapters, and the region they were charged with protecting was reduced in its defenders accordingly. At their height, the 3 chapters together accomplished something real. They temporarily cleared Alara's Veil of the accumulated threats that had been pressing on it from every direction. The worlds within the Veil entered a period of something approaching safety, which in the 41st millennium is never safety in any absolute sense, but is at least a reduction in the immediate terror level to manageable proportions. The Lions had their brothers. The Spears had their brothers. The Star Scorpions were still present and still fighting. The Adeptus Veilari functioned as it was designed to function, and the result was something that the people living in the Veil could appreciate in concrete, daily terms. Then Qatar happened, and it all began to fall apart. And I want you to stay with me for all of it, because every part of this story matters. Every detail, every decision, every moment when someone who had the power to do the right thing chose not to. Drop a comment below telling me where in the world you are watching from and what time it is. I genuinely love knowing where this community is spread across the globe. And subscribe while you are there, because there is so much more of this story to tell, and so many more stories like it waiting to be found. Part 5. The Qatar Insurrection, the moment everything changed. In 948 of the 41st millennium, a planet called Qatar became a case study in how the Imperium's most powerful institutions can be used against the very people they are supposed to serve. Qatar was, at the time, a world in good standing with the ecclesiarchy, the enormous church of the Emperor of Mankind, the religious institution that forms the spiritual backbone of imperial civilization across 1,000,000 worlds. Worlds in good standing with the ecclesiarchy maintain their relationship with the church through the local priesthood, the men and women responsible for conducting the rites, maintaining the temples, and serving as the intermediaries between the ordinary population and the vast, silent, incomprehensible figure of the God Emperor on his golden throne. Most people on most worlds in the Imperium never interact with the imperial government in any direct sense. They pay their tithes, they follow their local laws, and their primary experience of imperial authority is through the priesthood that tells them how to relate to the emperor. The priesthood matters. The priesthood is, in a very practical sense, what holds the cultural consensus of the Imperium together at the level of individual communities. Qatar's priesthood had turned, not suddenly, not dramatically, not in a way that was obvious to the population, until the corruption had advanced far enough that resistance to it was difficult. The seduction of Slanesh, the chaos god of excess and sensation and pleasure, taken beyond any natural limit, is not an attack on faith as much as a corruption of it. It does not tell believers that their beliefs are wrong. It tells them that the truth their beliefs are pointing toward is more available, more direct, more immediately experienceable than the distant silence of a god who communicates through long-dead prophets and elaborate ritual. It offers transcendence without patience, connection without earning it, the religious experience without the religious discipline. The priests of Qatar fell for this, and when they fell, they carried their congregations with them, because that is how priestly authority works. And when the congregations fell, they carried the military structures that were staffed by members of those congregations, the Planetary Defense Force, the Imperial Guard regiments stationed in nearby systems, the chains of command that connected local authority to the broader imperial machinery. Within the range of Qatar's cultural influence, the heresy spread along exactly the lines you would expect, through exactly the networks that the ecclesiarchy's own organizational structure had created. Inquisitor Apollyon became aware of the situation. He was already in the region, already pursuing the suppression of Qatar's heretical movement, already blockading the system with an imperial navy fleet to prevent the rebellion from exporting itself further into the surrounding space. But he was an inquisitor, not a general. He had investigators and interrogators and the terrifying authority that the Inquisition invests in its members. He did not have the ground forces necessary to take a planet. So Apollyon did what inquisitors do in this situation. He requested Space Marine support. 5 companies of the Celestial Lions answered. 5 full companies under the command of Captain Saul, half the chapter at nominal strength, a substantial commitment of the Lions' total available force. The decision to send that many warriors speaks to how seriously the chapter took the request Apollyon had made clear, that this was not a minor suppression, but a significant regional heresy, and the Lions responded in scale. The campaign lasted approximately 3 months in the telling of it, though the accounts differ on the exact timeline. The Lions landed against virtually no military resistance, worth calling resistance, the corrupted PDF, and guard forces. On the surface, were not equipped or trained to contest a Space Marine insertion, and the chapter's forces established control of the planet's surface with the decisive, methodical efficiency that is one of the defining characteristics of Dorn's gene line. The rebels were defeated. The prisoners were numerous. The heresy was materially suppressed, in the sense that the armed forces supporting it were gone, and the populations who had joined the rebellion were now in custody or had surrendered. Captain Saul oversaw the final stages of the pacification, with the particular care of a commander who understood that beating the rebellion militarily was only the first part of the problem. The people of Qatar were not simply the enemy, they were the civilians of a chaos heresy who had been seduced and manipulated by corrupted religious authority, many of whom were not themselves devout Slaneshi worshippers, but simply people who followed what their priests told them and had thus been led somewhere terrible. The distinction between true believer and manipulated follower matters in terms of how you handle the aftermath of a pacification. Genuine heresy requires different treatment than manipulation. The work of sorting one from the other was underway. The Celestial Lions finished their part of the mission. They secured their prisoners, completed the military phase of the suppression, and prepared to depart. They boarded their ships and began the process of leaving orbit. And then Inquisitor Apollyon gave his second order. He ordered the Imperial Navy to bombard Qatar, not targeted strikes against military infrastructure, not precision action against specific locations of concern, a full orbital bombardment of the world's cities. A purging action designed to eliminate the entire population of the planet. 8 billion people, men, women, children, the soldiers who had surrendered, the civilians who had complied with the pacification, the people in custody, everyone. Apollyon's stated justification was that the corruption had run too deep, that Qatar had been touched by the influence of Slanesh so completely, so thoroughly, that to leave even a remnant population would be to leave a seed that would take root and grow again. That exterminatus, the complete elimination of a world's population, was not simply permissible, but required. Captain Saul tried to stop it. He countermanded the order with every gram of authority that a Space Marine captain commands, which in the imperial hierarchy is considerable. He objected formally. He made it clear that in his assessment, the command was not only unnecessary but counterproductive, that a population this thoroughly pacified, removed from the religious authority that had seduced them, given the benefit of proper spiritual guidance from clerics loyal to the genuine imperial faith, could be recovered. The heresy was defeated. The people were improvable. He could not stop it, An Inquisitor's authority in the field supersedes the objections of a Space Marine captain in most reading of Imperial law. The bombardment began. It was thorough. It was complete. 8 billion people gone. The silence after the bombardment was the kind of silence that does not actually exist, because space is always full of the sounds of ships and their operations, and the ambient noise of any vessel. But it was the kind of silence that lands in a room when something has happened that has changed the nature of what comes next, and everyone knows it. The Celestial Lions were horrified. Genuinely, specifically, deeply horrified, in a way that went beyond the abstract moral revulsion of watching a wrong thing done. Their cultural inheritance made it impossible for them to process what had just happened as an abstraction. 8 billion was not a number. It was an unimaginable quantity of individual people, each of whom had a community, a family, a history, a set of stories that would never be told now. The Lions valued community and legacy, and the irreplaceability of individual lives as core cultural principles, not as sentiments. Watching 8 billion lives simply erased felt, to the Lions, like a wound in reality itself, and they could not be silent about it. The chapter's leadership convened, and the decision was made with the specific certainty of people who understand that speaking is dangerous and have decided that the danger of silence is greater. The Celestial Lions condemned Inquisitor Apollyon publicly and loudly. They dispatched communications throughout the subsector, sending word to imperial governors and regional administrators and anyone with the authority and information to potentially do something with the knowledge of what had happened on Qatar. They named it plainly a massacre, not a purging, not an unfortunate but necessary action, a massacre. The murder of 8 billion people who had been effectively disarmed and pacified, and in many cases were already in imperial custody. The delegation that Captain Saul had attempted to assemble to go to Terra death speakers and war leaders, the chapter's most senior cultural and military officers, people whose testimony would carry weight, boarded their ship and set course for the throne world. They were going to make their case in person, to whoever on Terra would listen, to lay the evidence before whatever tribunal might be willing to hear it. They were going to make the Qatar massacre a matter of imperial record in a way that could not easily be suppressed. The ship never arrived. A warp storm drove it off course, far off course, deep into Orc territory, and the delegation was never heard from again. Warp storms happen. They are a constant hazard of travel in the Imperium, one of the unavoidable costs of the method of faster-than-light travel that humanity depends on for its interstellar civilization. Ships are lost in the warp regularly, and not every lost ship is the result of deliberate malice. Sometimes the warp simply claims people, the way oceans sometimes claim ships, as a fact of nature rather than an act of agency. But the timing was notable. The timing was, in fact, exactly the kind of timing that makes you look at a pattern and wonder about the nature of coincidence. Part 6. The Inquisition strikes back persecution without a face. Here is what makes the Inquisition, as an institution, particularly dangerous as an adversary. It does not need to declare war. It does not need to send troops, or issue formal condemnations, or take any action that leaves a clear documentary record. It has methods that are quieter than any of those, more deniable, more suited to the long game of institutional pressure over time. It can operate in the spaces between official records, through the manipulation of information flows and logistics, and the quiet withdrawal of cooperation from bureaucratic networks that seem too mundane to be weaponizable, until you look at the cumulative effect of their use against a specific target over a period of years. The Inquisition was, in the popular understanding of the Imperium's ordinary citizens, a single, unified institution with coherent leadership and common purpose. The reality was far more complex and far more dangerous than this popular understanding suggests. The Inquisition was, and is, an aggregation of individuals, each invested with nearly absolute operational authority within their sphere of action, each answerable in meaningful, practical terms to almost nobody. The Ordos within the Inquisition, the Ordo Malleus that hunts daemons, the Ordo Hereticus that hunts heresy, the Ordo Xenos that hunts alien threats, were not chains of command. They were philosophical alignments, loose associations of like-minded practitioners. An inquisitor of the Ordo Hereticus did not report to a superior in any conventional sense. They reported to their own judgment, and their own judgment was backed by the full, terror-inducing authority of the inquisitorial mandate. This structure makes the Inquisition both extremely effective at what it is designed to do and extremely resistant to accountability for what it does wrong. There is no appeal process for the victims of an inquisitorial decision. There is no internal disciplinary mechanism that an ordinary person can access from outside. The same authority that makes inquisitors effective at hunting genuine threats makes them nearly untouchable when they have decided that a particular target, say, a Space Marine chapter that publicly accused one of their number of committing a massacre, needs to be managed. The management of the Celestial Lions, in the years following the Qatar massacre and the chapter's public condemnation of Apollyon, took the form of a campaign of quiet, systematic obstruction, not an immediate overt attack. That would have been politically difficult. The Lions were a loyal chapter with a long record of service and genuine allies in the form of their Adeptus Veilari brothers and the broader kinship of Dorn's gene line. An open attack on a loyalist Space Marine chapter required justification, and the Lions had given none. But obstruction? Interference with information flows? Subtle manipulation of the military intelligence that the Lions depended on for their operations? Quiet conversations with naval administrators about the priority of requests from the Celestial Lions fleet? These things are hard to prove. They are hard to even identify as a pattern, rather than simply as the normal friction of operating within a vast, imperfect bureaucratic system. Every individual incident could be explained away. Together, they formed something coherent and purposeful. The Lions began to find their intelligence less reliable. Reports that should have given them accurate enemy assessments arrived either late or garbled, or simply wrong, in ways that only became apparent after the Lions had acted on them and found the situation on the ground to be significantly different from what they had been briefed. Every time they made a decision based on available information, the gap between expectation and reality seemed a little wider than chance would suggest. This had operational consequences. Operations that should have gone cleanly went less cleanly, took longer, cost more in resources and time, and occasionally in lives. The Lions were not destroyed by this. They were good enough at their work that even degraded intelligence support did not prevent them from accomplishing their missions in most cases. But it wore on them. It forced them to operate with a layer of chronic uncertainty that their counterparts in better supported chapters did not face. And it reduced their strategic margins, the buffer of resources and time, and operational flexibility that an organization needs in order to respond to unexpected crises. When the Third War for Armageddon began, and the Lions received orders to deploy, they were already in a somewhat weakened position compared to where they should have been. Their intelligence-gathering capacity had been quietly degraded. Their relationships with some of the wider Imperial logistical network had been subtly poisoned by years of whisper campaigns that nobody could quite identify, but that had slowly eroded the automatic goodwill that loyal Space Marine chapters normally enjoy. They were going to a war zone without the full support structure they deserved. And they were going to a war zone where someone had already decided what was going to happen to them. Part 7. Armageddon, the grinding approach to catastrophe. Armageddon. It is impossible to discuss this planet in the context of the 41st millennium without acknowledging the weight of the name and the weight of the history. This is a world that has served as the stage for three of the most significant military engagements in the Imperium's recent history, each one leaving the planet more scarred, more fortified, more thoroughly soaked in the blood of every species and ideology that has contested it. By the time of the Third War, Armageddon was less a living world than a fortress. A vast, layered hive of industrial civilization sitting atop ash wastes and volcanic plains, its populations hardened by generations of living under military occupation of one kind or another, its administrative culture so thoroughly shaped by the experience of siege that the distinction between wartime and peacetime had become meaningless. Gazkul Mag Uruk Thraka came back to Armageddon for the third time with a force that defies easy description. The Orc war migration that descended on the system in the Third War was not simply a large army, it was a civilization in motion, a species-level expression of the greenskin's essential nature, which is to find the biggest, most challenging, most contested fight available and hurl itself into it with complete and enthusiastic commitment. The numbers involved in the Third War for Armageddon were in the hundreds of millions of orc warriors, supported by an industrial capacity that the greenskins call scrap building, but which produces weapons and vehicles and warships of genuinely formidable capability, supported by the bellowing, species-wide enthusiasm that is the green species' most characteristic trait. Against this, the Imperium mobilized everything it could. Imperial Guard regiments from across the sector and beyond, measured in the millions of soldiers. Naval assets rerouted from other operational commitments. Multiple Space Marine chapters, each bringing its specific capabilities to bear on the situation. The defense of Armageddon became a theater of war that drew participants from across the broader region. And for most of those participants, the assignment was exactly what it appeared to be: a massive, brutal, grinding war against the most numerous and belligerent xeno species in the galaxy. For the Celestial Lions, the assignment was something more than it appeared. The chapter was deployed to the defense of Hive Volcanus, one of the great city stacks of Armageddon's surface, housing millions of the planet's population. Hive Volcanus sat in a strategically significant position in the southern continent, guarding approaches that the Orc advance would inevitably press, and the Lions were tasked with the defense of this sector as their primary operational responsibility. They arrived and set to work with the efficiency of a chapter that had spent thousands of years managing the defense of a region against constant pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. From the beginning, the intelligence was wrong. Not slightly wrong, not wrong in the ways that are understandable given the chaotic conditions of a planet-wide war with hundreds of millions of combatants. Wrong in ways that seemed patterned. The Lions were told that specific Orc concentrations were in specific locations, and when they arrived at those locations, the Orcs were not there, or were there in much smaller numbers than briefed, or had been replaced by a different kind of force than expected. They were told that routes were clear, and the routes were either mined or covered by pre-positioned fire. They were told that their flanks were supported, and the supporting forces were either not in position or were engaged with emergencies of their own that had not been communicated in advance. Every single engagement deviated from its briefing. In warfare, some deviation is normal, and expected. The famous adage that no plan survives contact with the enemy exists for very good reasons. But there is a difference between the normal friction of war and a consistent, predictable pattern of deviation in directions that systematically disadvantage a specific force. The Lions began to take casualties that did not match any reasonable assessment of their capability. Month after month, the slow attrition continued. Brothers who had survived decades of service in Alara's Vale were dying on Armageddon, not in the heroic last stands that fill the chapter histories, but in frustrating, badly managed engagements where the Lions were consistently in the wrong place, at the wrong time, against the wrong force. The Death Speakers kept their records. They named the dead with the full specificity that the Lions' tradition demanded, and the accumulated weight of those names grew heavier with every week that passed. The Lions raised the problem formally, through official channels. The intelligence was defective. Their operational effectiveness was being degraded by information that was either bad or being manipulated. Something was wrong, and it needed to be addressed. The responses they received were exactly what you receive when you raise concerns through official channels that have been compromised: formal acknowledgement, expressions of sympathy, assurances that the matter would be looked into, and then nothing. The intelligence did not improve, the operational picture did not clarify, the casualties continued, and the thing that was coming in the Mannheim Gap continued to assemble, piece by piece, as the months passed. Part 8. The Mannheim Gap Treachery in the Killing Ground. The mission order that sent the Lions into the Mannheim Gap was, on paper, the kind of deep strike action that Space Marines are specifically built to execute. The Mannheim Gap was a canyon system running through the mountains north of Hive Volcanus, a natural choke point whose control had significant strategic implications for the defense of the surrounding region. The intelligence summary attached to the order indicated that a concentration of Orc Gargants, the enormous walking war machines that the Greenskins build from accumulated scrap and sheer mechanical enthusiasm, were positioned in and around the gap in an inactive state. If these Gargants could be destroyed before they were brought to operational readiness, the subsequent defense of the Hive's northern approaches would be significantly simplified. The mission parameters were challenging but executable. Deep infiltration into contested territory, location and destruction of specified targets before they could be activated, withdrawal under fire, the kind of operation that demands precision, good intelligence, and the specific kind of controlled aggression that the Lions had spent centuries developing in Alara's Vale's various campaigns. A hard mission, a manageable mission, a mission that should have gone the way hard, manageable missions go for a Space Marine chapter. The Celestial Lions went into the Mannheim Gap and walked into a trap that had been waiting for them. There were no inactive Gargants. There was an army. An entire orc army, carefully and deliberately positioned along the floor and walls of the canyon, concealed with a level of tactical discipline that the greenskins do not typically demonstrate, and that someone with detailed knowledge of orc behavior would have immediately recognized as anomalous. Thousands of orc warriors packed into a killing ground, along with not inactive Gargants that had been positioned to channel the Lions toward the canyon floor rather than away from it. The war banners hanging from the canyon walls were decorated with the bodies of celestial lions taken in earlier engagements. The orc commanders had been collecting the lions dead, the banners said. In the visual language of orc warfare, "We knew you were coming. We have been waiting. We have been collecting evidence of our previous victories over you because we knew we would win more." Someone had told the orcs that the lions were coming. Someone had shared the operational details of the mission with the enemy force that was being tasked to oppose it. The orcs had been given enough time to prepare the ambush, which requires either very specific tactical intelligence delivered well in advance or a period of contact between the orc commanders and an imperial source that had access to the Lions' operational planning. Neither of these possibilities is a comfortable one. The orc warlord commanding the forces in the Gap was a creature of extraordinary size and durability, the kind of senior orc leader that accumulates scrap armor and biological mass until the distinction between the two is unclear. He ate his own dead during the battle, which is both a statement of orc biology and a deliberate dominance display, a communication that in his hierarchy, death is simply the next thing to be consumed. War leader Vulark of the Lions drove the chapter's ceremonial war sword, Jahara, into the creature's abdomen and withdrew 3 meters of intestinal material. It kept fighting. The Lions fought through the initial surprise of the ambush with the stubborn, controlled ferocity of warriors who have been trained from the moment of their creation to respond to ambush not with panic, but with the specific, efficient application of violence in the direction of whatever is shooting at them. They gave ground only when giving ground was tactically necessary. They protected each other with the instinctive mutual support that the Lions' communal training and cultural values had built into their combat reflexes over decades of service. But the killing ground was designed for them. The canyon walls channeled them. The orc numbers were too many, too well positioned, too obviously forewarned of exactly how many lions were coming and what their approximate positions would be. And then, the snipers opened fire from the canyon walls above, with weapons that the Lions recognized immediately, even in the chaos of the engagement, because they had used the same weapons themselves. Imperial long-lost laser sniper rifles, their discharge leaving the precise, clean burn that distinguishes them from orc projectile weapons as clearly as a signature. Not the random, enthusiastic shooting that orc-ranged combat is characterized by. Precise, clinical, methodical targeting of specific individuals within the Lions' formation. The snipers targeted the apothecaries first, then the death speakers, then the war leaders, the officers and specialists, the people who were hardest to replace, who represented not just individual combat effectiveness, but institutional knowledge and cultural continuity and the logistical capacity to maintain the chapter's future. An apothecary's death means gene seed cannot be recovered from the fallen. A death speaker's death means the specific, accumulated cultural knowledge of stories and traditions and histories that they carry is lost along with them. A war leader's death means a gap in the command structure that takes years of training and experience to fill. Whoever ordered the sniper fire understood Space Marine chapter structure with the precision of someone who had studied it specifically in order to identify its most vulnerable points. The Lions fought for 4 hours to break out of the killing ground. 4 hours of sustained, desperate combat against overwhelming numbers in a terrain that favored the defenders over the attackers. They carved their way back the way they had entered, covering their withdrawal with the kind of disciplined, mutual protection that is the highest expression of the Lions' combat culture, every step backward, covered by fire. Every fallen brother, carried out when carrying was possible. The line held by warriors who were willing to stand in a specific place and die there, if it meant the person beside them could move. When the survivors broke out and began the march toward Hive Volcanus, they counted their strength. 96 Space Marines, from a full chapter, 96 warriors. And within hours of their arrival at Hive Volcanus, the last surviving apothecary of the Celestial Lions, the last person in the chapter with the equipment and the training to harvest gene seed from the fallen, was found dead. He was slumped against the side of a rhino transport vehicle. A single last burn through his temple. His medical equipment was gone. The gene seed he had been carrying, harvested with desperate care from the fallen of the Mannheim Gap during the withdrawal, the precious biological material that represented the chapter's future warriors, was gone. One shot, clinical, through the helm, from close range. The kind of shot that is made by a person who knows what they are doing, who has identified a target and eliminated it with the efficiency of long practice, who is not the kind of person who makes mistakes about whether their target is dead. The dead of the Mannheim Gap lay unharvested in the canyon, their gene seed lost, their potential future brothers lost with them. The chapter's capacity to rebuild, in the normal way, through the slow, careful cultivation of gene seed from living brothers, and the recovery of gene seed from the fallen, had been catastrophically compromised in the space of a single afternoon. 96 warriors, no apothecary, no gene seed. The battle still ongoing around them. The knowledge, now impossible to avoid, pressed down on the Lions' leadership with the specific weight of a thing that has been realized rather than suspected. This was not bad luck. This was not the fog of war. This was a campaign of deliberate destruction conducted against a loyal Space Marine chapter from within the institutional machinery of the Imperium itself. They had been sent to Armageddon to die. The Lions gathered themselves in the ruins outside Hive Volcanus, counted their 96 remaining warriors, and a conversation occurred in the ruins that would become one of the most quietly devastating scenes in the lore of the 41st millennium. Death Speaker Julkara recorded a hololithic message, a plea for help and a testimony, a careful, specific accounting of what had been done to the Lions, where and when and how, assembled with the Death Speaker's traditional care for detail and accuracy, made with the full knowledge that this might be the last recording the Lions ever made, and that its primary purpose was therefore not to save the chapter, but to make sure the truth survived even if the chapter did not. Julkara addressed the message to Reclusiarch Merrick Grimaldus of the Black Templars. Because the Lions had not forgotten that they had brothers, and because some debts between Sons of Dorn do not expire, Part 9, Grimaldus, Dubaku, and the Price of Redemption. Merrick Grimaldus, the hero of Hell's Reach. A warrior whose exploits during the defense of Hive Hell's Reach earlier in the Third War for Armageddon had created a reputation that echoed across multiple chapters and multiple sectors, whose name had become shorthand among the Imperial forces on Armageddon for a particular quality of stubborn, unbreakable, absolutely refusing to accept defeat, resolved that the situation seemed to demand. Grimaldus had held Hell's Reach when it should not have been holdable. He had done it through the specific, burning clarity of a man who had decided that this was the place and this was the moment, and that history would record what happened here as worth remembering. He received Julkara's message. He investigated. He went to the Lions. What he found outside Hive Volcanus was the wreckage of a chapter that had survived something that should have killed it entirely. 96 brothers, some still carrying wounds, standing in the dust and the ash of Armageddon, gathered around Pride leader Ekene Dubaku in the specific silence that settles on people who have processed a catastrophe and are now trying to decide what comes next. Dubaku's request to Grimaldus was the most specific, the most revealing, the most heartbreaking thing in this entire story. He did not ask for reinforcements. He did not ask for tactical support. He did not ask Grimaldus to help the Lions continue fighting. He asked Grimaldus to perform the last rites, the funerary ceremony of the chapter, the formal prayers and blessings that mark the end of a chapter's vigil, the acknowledgement that the watch is over, the spiritual closing of a story that has reached its conclusion, because the lions had decided to go back to the Mannheim Gap and die there. To return to the canyon where most of their brothers had fallen, to fight until there were none of them left, to die in the same ground where the dead lay waiting for them, and in doing so to honor the dead in the most absolute way available to them. Not as an act of despair, exactly, though despair was present, as an act of cultural fidelity, an expression of the lion's deepest value. The community does not leave its members behind, even when the members in question are already gone. It is worth pausing here to sit with that decision and what it says about who the lions were. Most military organizations, faced with the kind of catastrophic losses the lions had taken, would focus on preservation, save what remains, rebuild. The future is more important than the past. The living have obligations to the living that supersede obligations to the dead. This is sensible reasoning, and it reflects the way that most functional institutions handle catastrophic loss. The lions were not most institutions. The decision to go back to the Mannheim Gap and die there with the fallen was not irrational within the specific cultural logic of Elysium 9. It was the expression of a value the community stays together, taken to its absolute conclusion by people who had literally no other way to honor that value in the circumstances they found themselves in. You cannot leave your brothers lying unavenged in a canyon. You cannot simply return home and pretend that the gap where they used to be is something you can fill with ceremony and time. You go back. You stand in the place where they fell. You fight until you cannot fight anymore. And then you are with them. Grimaldus refused. He refused in the way that Sons of Dorn refuse things, not gently, not with elaborate apology, but with the flat, clear certainty of a man who has assessed the situation and determined that there is another option available, and that the option being proposed is not going to happen on his watch. He was not dismissive of what the lions had decided. He was not contemptuous of the cultural logic that had produced the decision. He simply would not perform the last rites of a chapter he was not prepared to acknowledge as finished. What he offered instead was a different kind of redemption. The lions would go back to the Mannheim Gap, yes, but they would go back to fight, not to die. They would assault the orc positions there. They would attempt to destroy the warlord who had commanded the ambush, war boss Thogfang, whose forces had been operating in the gap, and whose destruction would constitute a specific, witnessed act of vengeance for a specific, witnessed wrong. And if they could accomplish this, if this last battle could be fought and won, then the survivors could return to Elysium the Ninth and rebuild without the weight of the canyon pressing on their backs. Grimaldus called in support. The hero of Hellsreach had credit to spend in the political economy of Armageddon's military command structure, and he spent it to provide the Lions with the backing they needed for one more battle. Imperial Guard regiments of the Armageddon Steel Legion were committed to the operation. Grimaldus himself would fight alongside the Lions, the Sons of Dorn, standing together in the canyon where so many Sons of Dorn had already fallen. The resulting battle was as costly as the Lions had known it would be. Almost all of what remained of the chapter went into the Mannheim Gap for the second time, and almost all of them died there. The cannon fodder, if you want to be cynical about it, was willing cannon fodder warriors who understood the odds and had chosen this anyway. But they were not simply dying. They were fighting, specifically and purposefully, for the specific and purposeful goal of reaching war boss Thogfang and Ekene Dubaku, pride leader of the Celestial Lions, the last senior officer of a chapter that had been picked apart systematically over the course of weeks by Imperial weapons wielded by Imperial hands, reached Thogfang. With Grimaldus fighting at his side, covering his advance in the chaos of the engagement, Dubaku killed the warlord, the leader of the orc forces in the Mannheim Gap, the creature whose command had presided over the ambush and the deaths of his brothers. It was not justice. Justice is not available in the 41st millennium in any clean or complete form, but it was specific, and it was witnessed. And for the Lions, the specific witnessed vengeance mattered in a way that no amount of ceremony or formal acknowledgement of their losses would have matched. After the battle, High Marshal Helbrecht of the Black Templars arrived. He looked at Ekene Dubaku, the last pride leader of a chapter that had been reduced to fewer than a company's worth of survivors, and he forced him to accept the title of Chapter Master, not asked. Forced. The distinction matters, because the forcefulness is itself a message. Helbrecht was not offering Dubaku an honor. He was refusing to let Dubaku refuse it. He was insisting, with the absolute certainty of a High Marshal of the Black Templars, that the Lions were not finished, that they had a chapter master, and that chapter master was Ikene Dubaku, and that there was work to do. The suit of armor that Helbrecht gave to Dubaku, along with the title, was a relic that defies easy emotional category. Ancient power armor, dating back to the Great Crusade of the 30th millennium, still bearing the symbols of the original Imperial Fists Legion. Armor that connected Dubaku not just to the chapter he was now leading, but to the Primarch himself, to the unbroken 10,000-year line of Dorne's sons, to everything the Lions had always been and had nearly ceased to be. It was practical armor. It would protect him in the battles ahead. But it was also, in the deepest sense, a statement. You are the continuation of something that began before the Horus Heresy. You carry that forward. There is no version of this story where you do not go home and rebuild. The Black Templars gave the Lions the strike cruiser blade of the Seventh Son, a gift of genuine consequence, a warship capable of carrying the chapter back to Elysium 9 and serving as their operational base during the long process of rebuilding. A Templar detachment accompanied them home to assist with the reconstruction, to bear witness in their own way to what had happened on Armageddon, and to what the chapter was going to need to do next. Ikene Dubaku, in the armor of the Great Crusade, sailed home. Part 10. Rebuilding from Nothing, the Long Way Back. The return to Elysium 9 was not a triumphal arrival. There are no accounts that describe crowds or ceremonies or the sounds of a homeworld welcoming its defenders back. The Celestial Lions came back to their jungle world, carrying the weight of what had happened on Armageddon, the way that survivors always carry the weight of what they have, survived not as a visible burden, but as something that had changed the fundamental texture of how they experienced everything else. Rebuilding a Space Marine chapter from the near wreckage that Armageddon left is, even under the most favorable conditions imaginable, a generational undertaking. The gene seed situation was the most immediate and most serious problem. The Lions had lost the vast majority of their gene seed stockpile on Armageddon to the deaths in the canyon, to the Imperial snipers who had specifically targeted the apothecaries in order to prevent recovery, to the murder of the last apothecary, and the theft of his materials within hours of the battle. What remained in the chapter's stores on Elysium 9 was the starting point of everything that came after, and it was not a generous starting point. The mathematics of chapter recovery from a gene seed shortage are unforgiving. You need living battle brothers to contribute ongoing gene seed. You need apothecaries trained to the correct procedures for harvesting and cultivating it. You need time, years per cycle of cultivation, decades per generation of warriors built from the cultivated material. You need the chapter's homeworld recruitment pipeline operating at full capacity, because you are simultaneously trying to build your gene seed stock back up and train new warriors to the standard required. And the two processes compete for the same limited resources of attention and specialized personnel. The Black Templar's assistance was real and meaningful in this context. Having a trained Templar apothecary working alongside whatever apothecary capability the Lions could rebuild from their 96 survivors was not a trivial contribution. Having additional experienced warriors present during the early years of rebuilding who could help train the new generation of Lions, while the chapter's own senior personnel were focused on the organizational work of reconstruction, made the difference between a process that could succeed on a reasonable timeline and one that might have collapsed under its own weight. Ikene Dubaku led all of this. He was not a chapter master who administered from distance. He participated in the work directly, carrying the organizational responsibilities of his title, while also maintaining the personal connections that the Lions culture demanded of its leaders. He walked the recruitment trials. He sat in the storytelling circles. He remembered the dead specifically and by name, with the attention that the chapter's tradition called for, because the 96 survivors carried an enormous weight of individual grief alongside the institutional grief of the chapter's near destruction. And Dubaku understood that these were not separate problems. The chapter's culture survived the near destruction because culture lives in people, and the people who had survived the Mannheim Gap had the culture so deeply embedded in them that there was no way to separate the two. The storytelling continued with the material of the catastrophe now occupying the center of the narrative in a way that nothing had since the chapter's founding. The dead of Armageddon were named and remembered in the full Lions fashion, with the specific attention to individual personality and the specific texture of individual loss that the Elysium 9 tradition demanded. What this meant was that the new generation of warriors, being raised from Elysium 9's tribes, did not grow up in a chapter that had processed and moved past the Armageddon catastrophe. They grew up in a chapter for which the Armageddon catastrophe was the central story of recent history, told in full and unflinching detail, with the names attached, with the evidence of what had been done by imperial institutions to loyal imperial warriors clearly understood. The new Lions knew, from the beginning of their time in the chapter, what the Inquisition had done. They knew who Apollyon was. They knew about the snipers on the canyon walls, and the stolen gene seed, and the delegation that had been sent into a convenient warp storm. This was dangerous knowledge to institutionally possess. It was also, in the Lions' cultural logic, necessary knowledge because the community that does not remember what was done to it is a community that cannot protect itself from having the same thing done again. The chapter's relationship with the Black Templars deepened during this period in ways that would matter when the next crisis came. The Templars, who had accompanied the Lions home, did not simply provide temporary assistance and then return to their crusade. They became advocates within the broader Sons of Dorn network for the Lions' situation, for the justice of their grievance, for the obligation that the wider family of Dorn's line had toward a chapter that had been attacked while serving the Emperor faithfully. The Sons of Dorn do not forget obligations, and the Templars have long memories. Meanwhile, in Alara's Vale, the Emperor's spears held the line alone. The region that had once been defended by 3 chapters was now defended by 1, and whatever reduced operational capacity the rebuilding Lions could contribute, and the pressure on the spears was real and grinding, and showed no signs of reducing, simply because their partners were going through a crisis. Dubaku's rebuilt Lions rejoined the Adeptus Violari's operations as quickly as the reconstruction allowed, contributing whatever they had available to the collective effort, even when that contribution was smaller than anyone would have wished. The chapter was not at full strength. It was not close to full strength, but it was present. It was fighting, and its continued existence was its most eloquent statement about what had been attempted and what had failed. Part 11. The Great Rift and the Final Losses. Everything changed when the Cicatrix Maledictum tore the galaxy in half. The Great Rift, the Cicatrix Maledictum, a permanent galaxy-wide tear in the fabric of real space itself, born from the largest demonic incursion in the history of the Imperium, sustained by the psychic energy of a galaxy in crisis, and the specific, focused will of the chaos powers that had been working toward this moment for millennia. The rift cuts across the entire width of the galaxy, dividing Imperial space into 2 distinct regions. On one side, connected to Terra and the Golden Throne and the light of the Astronomicon, the relative stability of what people now call the Imperium Sanctus. On the other side, cut off from all of that, plunged into a darkness that the Astronomicon cannot reach and that the warp treats as its own particular playground. The Imperium Nihilus. Alara's Vale landed on the wrong side of the rift. The entire region that the Adeptus Veilari had spent centuries defending was cut off, instantly and completely, from the wider Imperium. No reinforcements, no resupply, no communications that could reliably get through the churning warp weather on either side of the tear. The worlds of the Veil were on their own, defended by whatever forces were already present, against whatever threats chose to take advantage of the chaos that the rift's opening had created. And the Star Scorpions came back. Not as the Star Scorpions, not as the loyal chapter that had served the Adeptus Violari before vanishing into the warp during their catastrophic transit. The warp had taken them and done what the warp does to everything that survives within it. Long enough, it had changed them, twisted them, bent the reality of what they were, until what remained was something that served a very different set of powers than the ones they had sworn their lives to. They emerged from the Immaterium, calling themselves the Pure, a chaos warband leading an enormous host of mortal cultists and traitor military forces and mutants called the Exilarchy. Former brothers turned enemy, former guardians of Alara's Veil, now the spear of the assault against it. The specific tragedy of this is almost too clean to be accidental. The people who had been created to protect the veil, returning as the instrument of its destruction, and in the process, placing the lions and the spears in the position of fighting their own corrupted cousins across the void. The exilarchy's advance through Alara's veil was systematic. The pure, retaining from their former lives an intimate knowledge of the veil's defenses and the Adeptus Vialari's capabilities and limitations, directed the assault with a tactical sophistication that a purely external enemy could not have matched. They knew where the choke points were. They knew which worlds were most strategically vital. They knew how the lions and the spears were likely to respond to different kinds of pressure, and they applied pressure in the ways most likely to maximize disruption. Elysium the Nine fell within the exilarchy's line of advance. Akani Dubaku received the intelligence of what was coming, with time enough to act, though not enough time to succeed in full. He launched an evacuation. Knowing that he could not save everyone, knowing that the forces required to defend the planet against the exilarchy were not available, he directed the chapter's energies toward getting as much of the planet's population off-world as possible before the invasion completed. Not everyone. He was clear-eyed about that from the beginning, but enough. Enough to carry the culture of Elysium 9 forward in the people who had lived it, even after the world itself was lost. He reached out to Chapter Master Arakatas of the Emperor's Spears with a request that speaks, more than almost anything else in this story, to the kind of person Dubaku was. He asked if the refugees from Elysium the Nine, his people, the people who had provided the chapter with its warriors and its culture for 4,000 years, could be relocated to Nemeton, the Spear's homeworld, if Elysium could not be defended. A request that subordinated his own chapter's pride to the survival of the people they served. That asked a favor from an ally rather than demanding or taking. That thought, even in the middle of an invasion of his homeworld, about what came after. He was meeting with representatives of the Emperor's Spears aboard the warship Hex to discuss the logistics of this plan when the Calidus assassin struck. The assassin had been traveling in the retinue of Amadeus Caius Incarius, a warrior of the Mentor Legion who had crossed the Great Rift specifically to assess the military situation in Alara's Veil. The assassin had been posing as a chapter serf, a servant, an ordinary member of the non-Space Marine staff that accompanies any significant military delegation, the kind of person whose presence at a meeting is noticed but not scrutinized, the kind of person who can move through a room without generating the specific attention that armed warriors provoke. The assassin decapitated Ekane Dubaku. One strike. The chapter master of the Celestial Lions, the warrior who had survived the Mannheim Gap and accepted the burden of rebuilding, who had worn the armor of the Great Crusade as a daily commitment to a promise he had made to Helbrecht and to his chapter and to the dead of Armageddon, who had spent years doing the patient, grinding, unglamorous work of reconstruction without ever losing sight of the principles that made the Lions worth rebuilding, was killed in the middle of a planning meeting. The assassin had been sent by the Inquisition. The vendetta, which had begun with a public accusation and escalated through a missing delegation and years of false intelligence and the deliberate destruction of a chapter on the battlefields of Armageddon, had followed Dubaku across decades and the galaxy-sundering catastrophe of the Great Rift to end him in a meeting room while he was trying to save his people. This detailed the persistence of it, the patience of it, the fact that the Inquisition had waded through the Lions' rebuilding and Dubaku's rise to chapter master and the chaos of the Great Rift's opening and still found the moment, still dispatched the asset, still completed the erasure. This detail is what makes the story of the Celestial Lions not simply a tragedy, but a specific kind of horror. Institutions do not forget. Institutions that have decided you are a threat do not stop considering you a threat, simply because time has passed or circumstances have changed. The grudge was maintained with the patience of an organization that measures its timescales in centuries. The fate of Elysium 9's evacuated population remains, in the current lore, unresolved. The planet fell. The world that had given birth to the Celestial Lions is now under the control of the Exilarchy. Its jungles and its campfire circles and its warrior tribes and everything that had shaped 4,000 years of chapter culture, all of it lost. Whether enough people escaped to keep the spirit of Elysium 9 alive in a refugee community somewhere, Whether the culture survived in the people who carried it out of the system before the exolarchy arrived, this question does not yet have a canonical answer. Part 12. The Era Indomitus. Fighting in the Dark. The Lions continue to exist. In the Era Indomitus, the period following the Great Rift's opening, and the return of the Primarch Robout Guilliman, the Celestial Lions, are still present, still fighting, still serving as the reduced but unbowed remnant of what was once a full-strength chapter. They have received Primaris reinforcements, the new pattern Space Marines created through the work of Belisarius Cawl and distributed to depleted chapters throughout the Imperium as part of Guilliman's Indomitus Crusade. These reinforcements have boosted the chapter's numbers meaningfully, providing the Lions with fighting capacity they could not have generated through their own recruitment alone, given the gene seed situation and the time required for traditional chapter recovery. But Primaris warriors are a specific and complicated gift for a chapter like the Lions. Physically, they are superior to the traditional firstborn pattern of Space Marine, larger, more resilient, equipped with additional redundant organs that make them even harder to kill than their predecessors. Militarily, they are a genuine upgrade in capability, but they are not born on Elysium 9. They did not grow up in the warrior tribes. They were not raised from childhood through the full arc of Elysium's cultural transmission, the stories told around fires, the accumulated wisdom of a community that had been refining its values across generations of hard living in a dense jungle world. They can be taught the Lions' traditions. They can be introduced to the storytelling practice and the communal values and the specific vocabulary of a culture that carries the memory of Elysium 9 in its language and rituals. But learning a culture as an adult is different from absorbing it as a child. The difference is real, and the Lions, who understand better than almost anyone how culture is transmitted and how it is lost, know this. Alongside the Emperor's spears, the Celestial Lions are fighting a defensive war in the Imperium Nihilus that the lore describes, with characteristic 40K grimness, as a slowly losing campaign. The Adeptus Veilari at this point consists of 2 significantly depleted chapters against an enemy host that has home field advantage in the chaos of the Rift's aftermath, and that has the tactical knowledge of former Guardians of the Veil directing its attacks. The mathematical situation is not favorable, but the Lions are still there, still fighting, still naming their dead, with the full specific attention that their tradition demands, still gathering to tell the stories, still transmitting the values of community and legacy and courage to the warriors old and new who make up the chapter's present tense, still being, in the most essential sense, the Celestial Lions. The question of what Robout Guilliman knows about the full history of what was done to them is one of the most interesting, unresolved threads in the current lore. Guilliman has made his positions on the waste of Imperial resources and the abuse of Imperial institutions clear in his actions since his return. He has zero patience for the kind of politically motivated destruction of military assets that the Lions story represents. If and when he becomes fully aware of the complete accounting the Qatar massacre, the lost delegation, the false intelligence on Armageddon, the snipers in the canyon, the stolen gene seed, the Calidus assassin on the Hex, the political and military implications of that knowledge for the Inquisitors responsible would be significant. The Sons of Dorn are paying attention. The Black Templars have not forgotten what happened to their cousins. The Emperor's spears are fighting alongside the Lions every day and have personal witness to everything the chapter has suffered. The machinery of eventual accountability, if it comes, is present and assembled. Whether the lore moves in that direction is a question for future releases, but the pieces exist. Part 13. Why the Celestial Lions Matter. The story of the Celestial Lions is not simply one more chapter history in a setting that has hundreds of chapter histories. It is something more specific than that, and it is worth articulating what makes it more specific, why this particular story deserves the attention that the better-known chapters receive, why it has the power that it has. The Lions matter because they are the clearest possible example of something the 40K setting does better than almost any other science fiction universe, which is the honest examination of what large institutions actually are and what they do to people who challenge them. The Imperium is presented not simply as heroic or as villainous, but as both simultaneously a system that is genuinely necessary for human survival in the 41st millennium, and that is also capable of monstrous acts in its own defense. The celestial lions are the specific, concrete expression of what that duality costs the individuals caught inside it. They spoke truth. They spoke it clearly, publicly, backed by the authority of a loyal Space Marine chapter with a 4,000-year record of service. They named a specific wrong, identified a specific wrongdoer, and attempted to hold that wrongdoer accountable through the legitimate channels of the Imperial system. And the legitimate channels failed them in every possible way. The delegation was lost, the evidence was suppressed, the formal complaints went nowhere, and the ultimate response of the institution they had criticized was to destroy them as efficiently as the institutional constraints allowed. This is not a story about the 41st millennium being uniquely terrible. It is a story about what institutions do when they prioritize their own preservation over the values they were created to serve. It happens everywhere, in every era, in every kind of organization. What the 40K setting gives us is the ability to examine this dynamic through the specific, heightened clarity of science fiction, to see it clearly, because it is removed from our immediate context, to feel its weight, because the characters are drawn with enough specificity and warmth that we care what happens to them. The lions also matter because of who they are, specifically. A chapter with roots in warrior tribes of African cultural heritage, whose armor is gold and black, whose officers carry titles drawn from a culture that is not the Greco-Roman European culture that dominates most of 40K's aesthetic, whose combat doctrine and cultural values reflect the specific environment of a jungle world rather than the fortress and siege world of their gene-father. The lions have been in the lore since the late 1990s, in the supplementary materials for the Third War for Armageddon campaign, and they were created not as a gesture toward representation, but as a piece of world-building that took seriously the implication of a galaxy-spanning human civilization, that such a civilization would contain every kind of human culture in every aesthetic and philosophical expression, and that some of those cultures would produce Space Marine chapters as naturally as any other. They are a proof of concept that 40K has always been capable of. The fact that they are not better known is a failure of attention rather than a failure of storytelling. The story is there. The lions are there. They have always been there, waiting for the audience that would find them and recognize what they were. The storytelling tradition of Elysium IX, the practice of keeping the dead present by continuing to speak about them, of maintaining cultural memory through the art of the told story, is the most deeply human thing in this story. It is the thing that is most recognizably continuous with the way real human communities actually process loss and maintain identity across time. You can transform people into something that can survive orbital bombardment and warp transit and the physical contact of the most dangerous life forms in the galaxy, and they will still need stories. They will still need to name their dead. They will still need the specific acknowledgement that the people who are gone mattered not in the abstract, but in particular, that their specific qualities, their individual contributions, their irreplaceable perspectives are being held in the memory of those who survived them. This is what the lions kept when everything else was taken. This is what survived the Mannheim Gap and the stolen gene seed and the assassination of Ekene Dubaku and the fall of Elysium IX, the practice of remembering. The commitment to telling the truth about what happened, to whom, and who was responsible. The refusal to let either the dead or the wrong done to them be forgotten. If you have watched this entire video, you are now part of that. You know the names. You know the story. You know about Qatar and the 8 billion dead and the delegation that never reached Terra. You know about the snipers in the Mannheim Gap and the apothecary found dead against his rhino. You know about Ekene Dubaku and the armor of the Great Crusade, and the meeting room on the Hex, where the Calidus assassin waited. You know about Elysium IX, and the campfire circles, and the warrior tribes, who gave a chapter its soul. Tell someone who would care. That is how the lions have always survived. That is how they will keep surviving. Closing your watch is not yet ended. If you have made it to the end of this, I want to say something that I mean without any performance behind it. Thank you. This story deserved its full telling, and you gave it the time to be told fully. That matters. The celestial lions are still out there, somewhere behind the Great Rift, fighting in the Imperium Nihilus alongside the Emperor's spears. In a slowly losing war that has been ongoing for a century since the rift's opening, their homeworld is gone. Ekene Dubaku is dead. The gene seed of hundreds of their brothers lies in the soil of Armageddon, permanently beyond recovery, and they are still fighting, still gathering to tell the stories, still naming the dead, still being, in the most specific and stubborn and essentially human way available to them, the Celestial Lions. If you want to read more about them, the primary recent source is the novel Spear of the Emperor by Aaron Dembski-Bowden, which gives the Lions significant attention alongside its focus on the Emperor's spears. The original Armageddon campaign material from Games Workshop, along with the novella Blood and Fire, contains their foundational story. The Warhammer 40,000 fandom wiki and lexiconum both have comprehensive articles on the chapter if you want to explore further. And future releases in the Warhammer universe may return to Alara's Veil and give us more of this story, which is very much unfinished. For this channel, the Celestial Lions are exactly the kind of story we exist to tell. The ones that are not on every cover. The ones that require a little digging. The ones that, when you find them, make you feel like you have discovered something that not many people know about, and that you are better for knowing. If there is a chapter you love that does not get enough attention, tell me in the comments. Suggest a topic. Describe what matters about it. This community has led me to some of the best material I have covered, and the community that is engaged enough to watch a 2-hour video about the Celestial Lions is the community that has the right instincts for where to look next. Subscribe if you have not. Like the video if the story moved you. Share it with one person who would appreciate it, because that is genuinely the most valuable thing you can do for a channel like this one. And remember, the Lions. Your watch may not be ended yet, but for now, rest well, sleep well. The story will be here when you wake up. Supplemental. The nature of institutional persecution and the Inquisition's long game. Something that deserves more direct attention, because it is easy to gloss over in the momentum of the narrative, is the specific mechanism by which an institution as powerful as the Inquisition pursues a vendetta against an equally powerful institution like a Space Marine chapter. The question of how you go about destroying something that is, on paper, your equal or superior in military capability is an interesting one, and the way the Lions story answers it is instructive. The Inquisition cannot simply declare war on a loyalist Space Marine chapter. The political cost of doing so is enormous. Space Marine chapters command the loyalty and respect of the populations they protect and the military officers they fight alongside. Attacking one openly requires justification that can survive public scrutiny within the upper tiers of imperial politics, and they criticized one of our number for ordering a massacre is not justification that survives any kind of scrutiny. The High Lords of Terra may be willing to overlook many things, but the open persecution of a loyal chapter creates the kind of precedent that even the most politically compromised imperial administrator would hesitate to set. So the Inquisition does not declare war. It uses deniability as its primary weapon. Every action taken against the Celestial Lions after Catter was designed to be individually explicable as something other than deliberate persecution. The delegation ship lost in a warp storm. Warp storms are real. Ships are genuinely lost in them. Plausible deniability is available. The degraded intelligence quality on Armageddon wars produce bad intelligence. The chaos of a planet-wide engagement creates genuine information gaps, difficult to prove intent from outcome alone. The snipers in the Mannheim Gap harder to explain, but by the time the evidence was clear the battle was over, the survivors were in no position to conduct a formal investigation, and any inquisitorial involvement could be attributed to rogue elements or denied entirely. The cumulative pattern is damning. Each individual incident is deniable. Together, they are a coherent campaign. But proving a coherent campaign in an institution as compartmentalized and self-protective as the Inquisition, through the legitimate channels of an imperial system that the Inquisition itself partially controls, is close to impossible. This is by design. The Inquisition's resistance to accountability is not an accidental feature of its structure. It is a deliberate one, built in over 10,000 years of bureaucratic evolution by people who understood that the power to investigate everyone is only useful if it cannot itself be effectively investigated. This aspect of the lion's story, the frustrating, grinding, institutional impunity of what was done to them, is one of the most realistic and therefore most disturbing things about it. You do not have to be in the 41st millennium to recognize this pattern. The gap between what can be proven and what is obviously true. The way institutional power protects itself by making verification difficult. The experience of knowing with certainty that something wrong was done and being unable to demonstrate it through the channels that are theoretically supposed to handle such things. The lions had to live inside this gap. They had the knowledge. They had the testimony of surviving brothers who had watched the Mannheim Gap unfold, who had heard the snap and burn of the long-lost rifles, who had seen the specific, clinical targeting pattern that no orc sniper would produce. They had the physical evidence of Imperial weapons, identifiable by their wound signature. They had the accumulated pattern of bad intelligence and missing support and the convenient warp storm that swallowed their delegation. And they had, in the aftermath of Armageddon, essentially nothing they could do with any of it. The chapter went home. They rebuilt. They filed the knowledge away in the storytelling tradition, in the specific, accurate accounts that the Death Speakers maintained of what had happened and why and who had done it. And they kept serving, which is, in its own way, the most powerful thing they could have done. Because the institution that had tried to erase them was still there, still operating, still expecting them to eventually be gone, and the lions, stubbornly, infuriatingly, with the specific pig-headedness of Sons of Dorn, were not gone. Were not going to be gone. Were actively, deliberately, with full knowledge of what had been done to them, refusing to be gone. There is a kind of resistance in continuity that does not require weapons or formal declarations or the mobilization of allies. It is the resistance of simply persisting in the face of attempts to erase you. The resistance of being present and known and counted when someone hoped you would be absent and forgotten. The Lions' continued existence, their continued service, their continued clear-eyed maintenance of the historical record of what had been done to them, this was resistance as much as anything they did on any battlefield. The Sons of Dorn, and what family means in the 41st millennium. The Black Templars' involvement in the Lions' story deserves more attention than a passing mention, because the relationship between these two chapters illuminates something important about how kinship operates among Space Marine chapters, and why it mattered so much in this specific situation. The Black Templars are among the most dramatically different chapters from the Celestial Lions, in terms of surface culture. The Templars are a crusading chapter. In the most literal possible sense, they do not have a permanent homeworld, instead maintaining a fleet of crusade vessels constantly in motion, always pointed at the next enemy of the Emperor. Their religious culture is intense to the point of zealotry. Their commitment to the destruction of the heretical and the alien is expressed through an aesthetic of black and white cross iconography, of chaplains who preach battle sermons that would not be out of place in a description of medieval crusade culture. They are loud where the lions are warm. They are theatrical where the lions are communal. They wear their faith like armor, where the lions wear their relationships like armor. And yet, when the Celestial Lions were reduced to 96 survivors on the ash plains of Armageddon, it was the Black Templars who came. When Grimaldus refused to perform last rites and insisted instead on one more battle, that insistence was backed by the authority of a warrior who had earned the right to make demands of a broken chapter because he was there, present in the debris of the catastrophe, willing to fight in the canyon alongside the people he was making demands of. When Helbrecht forced Dubaku to accept the title of chapter master, the forcefulness was not a power move, but an expression of the same quality that Dorn's gene line produces in all its descendants, the absolute refusal to yield ground, even emotional and spiritual ground, even the ground of continuing to exist and serve. The Black Templars recognize the Lions as brothers, in the specific sense that the 40K gene lineage system creates brothers not metaphorically, but in a functional, biological, spiritually meaningful sense. Shared gene seed means shared Primarch, and shared Primarch means shared inheritance of a specific quality of character that the gene seed carries as surely as it carries physical transformation. Dorn's stubbornness runs in both chapters. The refusal to give ground runs in both. The commitment to holding what has been entrusted to you, no matter the cost, runs in both. In the Lions, this quality expressed itself as communal warmth and the insistence on remembering the dead. In the Templars, it expressed itself as religious zeal and eternal crusade. But the root quality was recognizable across the differences, and that recognition was genuine, and it mattered. The gift of the Blade of the Seventh Son, a strike cruiser with a name that connects it to the Imperial Fist's founding structure, was not simply practical assistance. It was a statement about family obligation. You are not alone. You have never been alone. Whatever was done to you was done to something we claim as our own, and we do not abandon our own. The temporary detachment of Templar warriors sent to assist with Elysium 9's reconstruction made the same statement in practical terms. The continued advocacy within the Sons of Dorn network, the Templars' communication to other Dornian chapters about what had happened and why it mattered, extended the statement into the broader family of the Conject. Primarch's line, "For the Lions, whose entire culture was organized around the value of community and the specific, concrete expression of solidarity in moments of crisis," the Templars' response to their catastrophe was perhaps the single most validating thing that could have happened. Not vindication in an institutional sense. The Inquisition remained unpunished, the truth remained unacknowledged in any formal imperial record. The justice that the Lions deserved remained absent. But validation from family, the acknowledgement from people whose opinion genuinely mattered that what had been done was wrong, and that the Lions were not alone, and that the family was watching and would continue to watch. This did not fix what had been broken. Nothing was going to fix what had been broken. But it made it possible to continue, and sometimes the ability to continue is the most important thing available. The living legacy, what the Lions passed to us. Every generation of lore in Warhammer 40,000 that touches on the Celestial Lions adds something specific and valuable to the story. The original campaign material established the framework, the chapter, the Qatar massacre, the Inquisition's vendetta, the catastrophe of Armageddon. The Aaron Dembski-Bowden material in the Spear of the Emperor novel deepened the story into the era Indomitus, gave us Ekene Dubaku as a fully realized character, gave us the assassination on the Hex, gave us the invasion of Elysium the Ninth and the Exilarchy, and the ongoing war in the Imperium Nihilus. Together, these sources have created one of the most complete and emotionally resonant chapter histories in the setting. What makes the Lions' story particularly valuable for the broader setting is that they are a chapter whose arc is not completed. They are not a chapter of heroes who died gloriously and are now enshrined in memory. They are a chapter that was systematically attacked by imperial institutions and is still dealing with the consequences, still fighting, still carrying the cultural inheritance of a world that no longer exists, still processing the loss of a chapter master who was killed in the middle of trying to protect his people. The story is ongoing. This matters because it means the Lion's story is available as a lens through which to examine the present state of the Imperium. When Robert Guilliman returns and begins his program of Imperium Secundus, his attempt to reform and rationalize the imperial system, the existence of a chapter that was nearly destroyed by one of the Imperium's own investigative agencies for the crime of objecting to a massacre is directly relevant to the question of what reform means and what it is up against. The Lions are evidence. Living, fighting, naming their dead evidence of what the Inquisition can do when it is not accountable to anything outside itself. Whether the lore uses that evidence is a question for future releases, but the evidence is present, the Lions are there, and the Sons of Dorn who witnessed what happened and who remember it are not in the habit of letting things go unaddressed indefinitely. The Celestial Lions' cultural practice of storytelling, of maintaining the specific, accurate memory of what happened and what it meant, is also a kind of instruction to us as the audience. The chapter survived because they remembered, they kept the names, they told the truth. They refused to let the dead be reduced to statistics or the wrong done to them be rationalized into acceptability. And in keeping the truth alive, they kept themselves alive. The audience of this video is now part of that tradition, in a small but real way. You know the story, you know the names, you know what happened in the Mannheim Gap and who was responsible and what it cost. The Lions will keep fighting in the Imperium Nihilus. The Adeptus Veilari will keep its vigil. And the story will keep being told, here and wherever else. People who care about the details of this universe gather to talk about the things that matter in it. Some chapters are famous because they are placed on the cover. Some chapters are famous because they sell the most miniatures. And some chapters are famous because their story is good enough, true enough, resonant enough, that the people who find it cannot help but tell it to the next person and the next, until the story travels further than any marketing campaign could have pushed it. The celestial lions are the last kind. Tell someone. Deep context. The Third War for Armageddon, and what it meant for everyone. It is worth stepping back from the lion's specific story for a moment to give you a fuller picture of the Third War for Armageddon, because understanding the scale and nature of that conflict makes what happened to the lions even more specific in its wrongness. The lions did not suffer in the background of a minor engagement. They were destroyed in the middle of one of the most strategically critical wars of the late 41st millennium, a war that drew participation from dozens of chapters and millions of human soldiers, and their destruction went essentially unnoticed in the official accounting of that war. Because the official accounting of that war was focused on the dramatic moments on Gazkul's eventual departure from the system, on the heroics of the Space Marines, who held the most famous positions, on the narrative beats that make for good propaganda. The Third War for Armageddon began in earnest around 998 M41, when Gazkul Mag-Uruk Thraka returned to the system he had contested twice before, and launched the largest greenskin military operation in the sector's recorded history. Gazkul is not an ordinary orc warlord, in the way that most orc warlords are not ordinary. The greenskin hierarchy is brutal and meritocratic in the most literal possible sense, and the entities that reach the top of it are genuinely formidable. But Gazkul was something beyond even this. He was, in the telling of the orc mythos, a prophet of the orc gods, Gork and Mork, a being whose faith in the essential rightness of the greenskin's bellicose existence had been rewarded with visions and insights that made him strategically capable in ways that most of his kind were not. Against this, the Imperium assembled a coalition of forces that included multiple Space Marine chapters, titans from the Adeptus Mechanicus, entire armies of Imperial Guard, from regiments famous for their performance in previous Armageddon conflicts, the native Steel Legion who knew the terrain of their world better than any outsider force. The combined strength of this coalition was enormous, and it was genuinely effective. Armageddon did not fall. The hive cities held, though some were reduced to rubble in the process. Gazkul eventually left, not because he was defeated, but because he had, in the peculiarly orc fashion of measuring success, accomplished what he came for, which was the biggest fight available. In this vast, sprawling, multi-front theater of war, one chapter's story was playing out in a specific sector of the southern continent, around a specific hive city, in a specific canyon. The lions were fighting their war within the larger war, and the larger war provided excellent cover for what was happening to them. Nobody monitoring the broader strategic picture of the Third War for Armageddon had the specific attention or the specific interest to notice that one chapter's casualty rate was dramatically, inexplicably higher than expected. Nobody was cross-referencing the Lions' operational reports against the 4,000 years before the storm. What glory looks like when nobody is watching. 4,000 years is a long time. In the sweep of the 41st millennium, with its 10,000 years of imperial history, and its endless wars, and its civilizations that rise and fall across centuries, 4,000 years might not seem like an extraordinary span. But for a Space Marine chapter, whose individual warriors live for centuries, but who replace themselves generation by generation, passing culture and gene seed and institutional memory forward across the slow accumulation of time, 4,000 years, represents something genuinely substantial. It represents the full flowering of a culture, the establishment of traditions deep enough that they feel ancient even to warriors who have been alive for 200 years. The development of a chapter identity so thoroughly worked out that it does not need to be articulated consciously, because it is simply how the lions are. Before Qatar, before the Inquisition, before the Mannheim Gap, there were 4,000 years of the celestial lions. Doing their work in Alara is Vale, and becoming something specific and genuine as a result. The campaigns of these 4 millennia are not well documented in the primary sources. This is, as we have discussed, a feature of the Lion's story rather than a bug. They operated far from the centers of imperial attention, in a region that generated minimal propaganda value. The battles they fought were not the kind that appear in the Administratum historical records that the wider imperial public has access to. They were the grinding, quiet battles of frontier defense. Alien incursions pushed back before they could reach the scale of existential threat, heretical cells suppressed before they could flower into regional rebellions. The accumulated small crises of a populated region on the edge of explored space, handled with the professional efficiency of a chapter that had been doing this specific work for a very long time. But the Lions did not experience these 4,000 years as an undifferentiated blur of frontier duty. Every battle they fought was a specific battle with specific fallen, and the fallen were named, and the names were kept, and the stories of what the fallen had done were maintained in the chapter's storytelling tradition with the care and specificity that Elysium 9's culture demanded. The accumulated weight of 4,000 years of names and stories was enormous. The chapter's cultural memory was dense with the specific texture of individual people, individual moments, individual acts of courage and sacrifice and community that the tradition had preserved across all those centuries. This accumulated memory was one of the things that made the Qatar massacre so specifically devastating. The Lions had spent 4 millennia learning to value individual lives with the full attention of their cultural tradition. They had 4,000 years of practice at maintaining the specific irreplaceability of specific people in the community's living awareness. And then they watched 8 billion specific, irreplaceable lives simply erased, in a matter of hours, by a decision made by a single individual who was not willing to engage with the possibility that those lives might be worth saving. The magnitude of this violation of everything the Lions had spent 4,000 years learning to value cannot be overstated. It was not an abstract moral offense. It was a direct attack on the principle that had organized the chapter's entire existence. This is why they could not be silent. 4,000 years of cultural inheritance demanded that they speak. War leader Vulark and the Gallery of the Fallen. Among the Lions who died in the Mannheim Gap, the war leaders deserve specific mention because they represent a specific kind of loss that the chapter could not easily recover from. War leaders in the Lion structure are equivalent to captains in Codex chapters, the senior company-level commanders who are responsible for the day-to-day operational leadership of the chapter's fighting elements. They are the accumulated experience and tactical judgment of the chapter, the people whose decisions directly determine how the chapter's battles are fought, and they are, by definition, among the most experienced warriors in the chapter, which means they are among the hardest to replace. War leader Dakembe was killed in the Third War for Armageddon. So was Vakembe, so was Vularak, who drove Jahara into the Canyon warlord's gut and found it insufficient. The death speaker Julkara, who composed the hololithic message that eventually reached Grimaldus, was also killed in the fighting. So was Spirit Walker Azada, so was Lifebinder Ketuk. The Lions who survived the Mannheim Gap were, by the logic of the ambush's targeting priorities, the battle brothers and sergeants, the warriors who were capable fighters, but who had not yet reached the threshold of seniority that made them primary targets for the Imperial long-last snipers. What this meant was that the chapter returned to Elysium IX with its fighting capability reduced to nearly nothing and its institutional experience reduced to even less. The knowledge that lived in a war leader's decisions, accumulated over decades of command, was gone. The specific cultural knowledge that lived in a death speaker's maintained oral tradition was gone. The medical capability that lived in an apothecary's training and equipment was gone. Rebuilding the warrior count was the most immediately visible challenge. But rebuilding the institutional depth, the specific expertise, the accumulated judgment, the cultural transmission that required someone to be the keeper of it, was in some ways harder, because it could not be accelerated by the gifts of outside chapters, in the same way that combat numbers could be supplemented by Templar assistance. Culture is transmitted slowly. Expertise is built through experience. The depth of institutional knowledge that the Lions had maintained for 4,000 years would take decades, perhaps generations, to rebuild to the point where it was once again genuinely robust. Ikene Dubaku understood this. His approach to the rebuilding placed cultural reconstruction as a genuine priority, alongside military reconstruction, not as a secondary concern to be addressed after the chapter was back to fighting strength. The storytelling circles were maintained. The Death Speaker tradition was re-established, with surviving brothers being trained specifically in the cultural maintenance aspects of the role, rather than simply the ceremonial ones. The specific, accurate memory of what had happened on Armageddon was maintained and passed on as the most important piece of recent history the chapter possessed. The Gallery of the Fallen from Armageddon became the central element of the chapter's memorial tradition in the rebuilding era. 96 survivors, each carrying the specific memory of multiple fallen brothers, each responsible for ensuring that those specific memories were communicated to the new warriors being raised from Elysium the Ninth. The sheer density of grief involved in this is hard to fully articulate. Imagine being one of those 96, carrying the memory of 10 or 15 or 20 fallen brothers, trying to give each one of them the full specificity of presence that the Lion's tradition demanded, while simultaneously learning to be a senior warrior in a chapter that has almost no senior warriors left, while simultaneously training a new generation that had not been there and cannot feel the specific weight of the names you are trying to transmit. This is what the Lions did. This is what rebuilding actually looked like in the quiet years on Elysium 9 after the blade of the seventh sun came home. One final thought on grief and the chapter that carries it. Every Space Marine chapter grieves. The losses of battle are constant in the 41st millennium, and no chapter escapes the experience of watching brothers die and carrying the specific absence of them afterward. But most chapters process grief through the institutional structures they have built for exactly this purpose: the funeral rites, the rolls of honor, the gene seed recovered and passed forward, the formal acknowledgement that serves to close a particular grief so that the living can continue to function. The Celestial Lions do not close grief in the same way. Their tradition does not permit the neat filing away of the dead as honored but finished chapters of a story that the living have moved on from. The dead remain present. The stories continue to be told. The community maintains the awareness that specific people are gone and that the space where they were is still visible, still affecting the shape of everything around it, even decades or centuries after the fact. This is harder. It is genuinely harder to carry grief that does not resolve than grief that has an institutional container built for it. But it is also, in the Lion's specific way of understanding what community means, more honest, more accurate to the actual experience of loss, which does not resolve cleanly no matter how much ceremony you bring to it. And it produces a chapter that is, in the deepest sense, paying attention to what is at stake, to who specifically is at risk, to the irreplaceability of every person in the community, which means every person in the community is being treated as irreplaceable rather than as a fungible resource that can be replaced by the next recruit. This quality, the maintained, specific, unresolved grief, is what made the Lions feel the Qatar massacre as deeply as they felt it, and it is what made them speak when speaking was dangerous. And it is what made the chapter's story, from that moment forward, a story about paying the cost of caring specifically rather than generally. They cared specifically, they paid specifically, and they kept going, specifically naming their specific dead, carrying their specific grief, fighting their specific battles in the specific darkness of the Imperium Nihilus, with the specific hope that the story is not yet finished. That is the Celestial Lions. In all the galaxy, in all its million worlds, and its 10,000 years of imperial history, that is them.